David Willey is a pinch hitter, I think. It's almost impossible to tell anymore. His batting map is all over the place. He batted between 7 and 9 over his first 5 innings of his T20 career, but he was up the order at number 3 in his 6th. 2 innings later, he was batting at number 10. I know much of that sounds like number wang, but Willey's batting map is just all over the place. 3 years into his T20 career, he was an opener, and then a tail ender, and a number 3, and then an opener again. It's a bit of a mess. Depending on the team and their needs, Willey has a new role. What is really different has been Willey's range. He's been a top 3 over 50% of the time, but also 34% of the time he's batted from 7 or lower. And he just doesn't appear much between numbers 4 and 6.
This is the last knot. My dad told me to say this.
He either bats at the top or the bottom. And this all started with Northand. And before Willey, they had Graham Swan, who did an incredibly similar thing. And now he's commentating on Willey in the IPL. Weirdly, considering his history as a pinch hitter in the top 3, twice in this league so far, Willey has batted at number 4. In the first game as a power play maximizer, which is basically a similar role than he's done right across his career so far in T20 cricket. And it didn't go well. Which is probably an understatement. He made 18 from 28 balls. He did it again in his following game, and he made a duck from 2 balls on the next attempt. But during his whole career, putting him up the order has actually been the best way to use him, because he struggles to score at the same speeds with the field out. He's at his best when he's at the top, but he's not always at the top. This despite the fact that he has a good record up there, averaging 27 with a strike rate of 145. But he's not always in that position because clearly he's just a slightly limited batter. The kind who can end up with an 18 from 28. And if he wasn't limited, he would never have been a pinch hitter. He just would have been a top order player. And within this lies the real reason of why you'd think in T20 we'd see more pinch hitters than ever before, but actually we see less. If you look at the fastest scorers of ODI cricketers in the 90s who batted in the top 5, you actually won't find many of the best players at all. You'll find a lot of bowlers, keepers, and a few all-rounders. That was the peak pinch hitter era. And ODI sides threw all sorts of players into their top order. Australia were all over this craze, using Peter Taylor, Brendan Julian, Simon O'Donnell, Craig McDermott, Ian Healy, Shane Warne, and even noted slowpoke Jason Gillespie as a pinch hitter. They tried everyone in this weird floating position that was very much the rage at that point. This wasn't just an Australian thing, nor was it just a 90s thing. It certainly happened before then as well. But the list of random players tried as pinch hitters in the 90s is phenomenal. Nicky Bowyer, Chetan Sharma, Rashid Latif, Ravi Ratnayake, Mark Elam, Chaminda Vas, Dominic Cork, Anil Kumble, Phil DeFreitas, Pat Simcox, Javagal Srinath, Junior Murray, Wasam Akram. In fact, Wasam Akram, when batting in the top 5 in one-day internationals in the 90s, averaged 14.5 and struck at 136. He was basically a T20 player before we knew there was T20. And there are many reasons that happened. One reason was the batters back then weren't as big as they are now. They didn't spend as much time in the gym. You may have seen the photo of Barry Richards holding the bats from the old days and then some of the modern Willow. You could do the exact same kind of thing with Corey Anderson's biceps next to Don Bradman. Batters of the 90s hadn't optimized their hitting prowess. They hadn't grown into massive beasts like the designated hitters of baseballs had. They hadn't grown into massive beasts like the designated hitters of baseball had. Of course, they also use steroids, but either way, they hadn't morphed into these big hitting machines. So in that period of the 90s, the fast bowlers were usually thought of as the stronger players, and many had the reputations of being the biggest hitters in their team. So they went up the order. Mind you, so did tiny spinners and wicket keepers. The idea was just quite clearly to throw someone up the order to cause chaos, and almost all of them kind of failed doing it. They just didn't make that many runs. Simon O'Donnell probably played one of the great early ODI innings, scoring 74 from 29 balls in Sharjah against Sri Lanka after coming in at number 4. And Chetan Sharma made a better than a runner ball 100 against England, coming up the order at number 4 in 1989. But more often than that, someone would come in, swing hard, and miss a lot. As a general tactic, the pinch hitter craze didn't really work that often at all. There were 2 notable exceptions. Shahid Afridi averaged 25 with a strike rate of 105 when going into the top 5. And Lance Klusener, 36 with a strike rate of 85. Those were quite special numbers for that era. But moving proper batters up the order was the real change, and it revolutionised ODI cricket. In the 1992 World Cup, Mark Great-Bachany and were both promoted, and both teams had success. But it was really the following World Cup where it kind of all changed. Sachin Tendulkar and Mark Waugh were already at the top by this point, so no doubt the theme had changed. Still, it was really the pairing of Sanath Jayasuriya and Ramesh Kallu-Witharana that changed kind of the entire sport. The two of them are so interesting because Jayasuriya was a proper batter who was unleashed with the new ball and the field up and exploded. And he went on to be an absolute legend, and everyone wanted a dazzling middle order player to start off their innings. But when you think of pinch hitters now, you more think of someone like Kallu-Witharana, who was a much more limited lower order player who didn't have the same effect as Jayasuriya. The fact that we still have a lot of players like Jayasuriya who are middle order players in red ball cricket but top order players in white ball cricket tells you how well that worked. We don't have as many Kallu-Witharanas anymore. And of course, pinch hitter is a baseball term where you can substitute a player out of your lineup for a pinch hitter. We don't have substitutions in cricket, so our version is to move someone up the order who doesn't usually belong that high based on their normal talent. And then they're given a license to score as quickly as possible, right? It could be an all-rounder promoted a few spots earlier, or it could be a tail-ender given the role of a lifetime. Some with nothing but free hits. The middle order batter opening now is so common that we don't even call them pinch hitters anymore. Even all-rounders going up the order happens a lot, but perhaps not as much as you'd assume in T20s. Perhaps the most famous recent case is New Zealand's Darryl Mitchell, who had never really opened before the last World Cup, but seemed to go okay. Willey's status in general cricket is more of a bowling all-rounder, but he does average 27 with the bat in first-class cricket. So people like Willey are on the lighter end of being a pinch hitter. What we've really lost is the tail-enders who swing. They're all but gone from our game. But they still appear occasionally. Like Mitchell McClenaghan was an occasional pinch hitter in the IPL. Our Ashwin, Harshal Patel, Jofra Archer, Shardul Thakur, they've all done it in the last 5 years as well. I suppose depending on Washington Sundar, he could count as well. Chris Morris probably did it more than most. But generally, it's just not part of the IPL or really wider T20 culture anymore. And part of that is because teams have specialist batters who hit and have license now. In this shortened game, batters aren't as cautious. And also the business economy of T20 has paid people to be more adventurous, so they already are doing that. On top of that, it's very hard to tell, who is a pinch hitter anymore. T20 cricket, the batting lineups are so flexible now. That top 7 is just moving over and over and over again. And more often than not, they're being used when they're very good against those conditions or those bowlers or in that situation. Dropping someone in from outside that hitting group makes less sense. And a bit like the Darryl Mitchell story, almost anyone who can bat in the top 7 now is also pretty much an opener whenever they need to be. So it's actually quite hard to tell who is an opener when looking at proper batters anymore. And since I've worked at T20, one of the questions I'm asked the most is why don't teams use pinch hitters more? And I get it, especially from the casual fans. We had them in the 90s, they were everywhere, we were always talking about it. And disposable wickets make the most sense in T20, on the face of it. If your tail doesn't face many balls, why not throw 1 or 2 up the order and let them have some fun? But there are a bunch of reasons why it doesn't happen more. Let's start with the most obvious. Tailenders don't bat down low by accident. They don't have the batting skills required to handle top-level bowling. So throwing them up the order over people who are paid millions of dollars seems like a bit of a waste. Also, while using all of your wicket resources in a T20 game makes the most sense, as in you really want your team going as hard for as long as possible, there are 2 sets of resources in a game. One is wickets, but the other is balls. And pinch hitters can waste balls. The first way is through the accidental go-so, which is probably what happened with the first Willey innings. If a pinch hitter enters and is out first ball, the commentators often call that a failure. But it isn't. The biggest crime is when they come in and eat up balls and are then out. A first ball duck is a par result for a T20 pinch hitter. Making 3 off 8 balls is a terrible crime. And often this happens through just swinging and missing. Instead of getting their fundamentals right, setting their base and playing to their strengths, they're out there slogging as hard as they can. So now you have a non-elite batter swinging before they are set, so obviously they're going to miss a lot. And not all those bad results come from players swinging and missing either. Anyone who's ever played cricket will tell you that batting numbers mess with players' minds. The tyranny of the batting order, I always call it. You can shave a rabid monkey and send it out to bat number 3, and it will suddenly have a high front elbow as it tries to pierce the offside ring. Many pinch hitters just start acting like batters instead of doing their job, and they're not as good as batters. But in the IPL specifically, and almost all T20, we now have something else that wasn't common in the glory days of pinch hitting: analysis. A tail-ender walking out now will be a collection of weaknesses, because if they weren't, they'd just bat higher. And before, teams barely spoke about what a tail-ender can do, and even if they did, they didn't have any ball-by-ball data or Hawkeye information to help with it. Now bowlers and captains know all the weaknesses of the 11 players they are facing. Scheming for a pinch hitter is really easy. chances are you know how to dismiss them, or more importantly, keep them to ones and dots. Because that is probably your best case scenario, getting them to chew up their team's own resources. And a pinch hitter can still do damage. If you have a number 9 who loves hitting off spin and a wicket goes in the first ball of an offie's over, you can send them in with 5 balls of free hits. Deepak Chahar would be a perfect option for this. If they get out, nothing is lost. But if the first ball they miss hit one out to long on, and then your left-hander gets stuck facing the off-spinner for the rest of the over, they may not even face much of the off-spinner. In fact, the fielding captain may actually remove the offie as well. Now that's a good thing as well, because it means you have upset the bowling plans of that team, without even really ever hitting a boundary. Of course that is nice, but it means almost nothing if your pinch hitter ends up with 7 from 11 balls. The best way to use your bowlers who can hit is in the power play. Sending them out there, let them swing hard, because even miss hits can be fours at that. And we already know there's going to be a lot of dot balls in the power play anyway. But teams seem to worry about losing 3 wickets in the power play, because of the whole 3 wickets in the power play and you lose 65 to 70% of the time. But surely if you lose your number 10 in the power play, that should mean a lot less to your chances of losing than a real top order wicket. I mean, there is a lot of data floating around the world of cricket, but I assume no one has actually looked at whether losing a wicket from the tail matters as much in the power play. That's a more confusing sentence than I thought it was going to be. So we now see less because there are just so many more downsides to a pinch hitter in a T20 match compared to what we saw in the ODIs of the 90s. A pinch hitter isn't a free hit. It's usually an unscientific gamble, and the odds are rarely in your favour. And that first game of Willey where he was pinch hitting, and the same game Sunil Narine was in his normal position. I mean, normal is not the right word for Sunil Narine and his batting position. He's batted every position in a T20 match, mocking Willey's 10 spots in the order. While Willey has batted down the order at 9 and 10, that's been in some powerful batting groups. Sunil Narine was a genuine number 10 and even popped in at number 11 a few times. And then he worked on his batting, and it wasn't really to go up the order, but just to learn how to hit a few sixes at the death. Well, he got so good at that Aaron Finch threw him up the order on a whim in a big bash match. Following in the PSL, he was used in the middle, and before long he was Kolkata's opening batter. Then he wasn't again, and he ended up back up in the middle order. He's not really a pinch hitter anymore. He's a low-scoring, fast-striking middle order player to maximise the spin overs and disrupt the opposition's bowling plans. That's not as catchy as pinch hitter though, is it? Basically, he was really good at pinch hitting, so he kind of does it permanently, or he's just a genuine batter now with a lower batting average. And when you look at the fastest scorers in the IPL when batting in the top 5, you will find Sunil Narine. And you can see on this list that it's mostly people who bat. With the ODI list that I showed earlier, was mostly bowlers, keepers, or bowling all-rounders. Narine stands out because of his 20 average and his 170 strike rate. Only Andre Russell is more striking, because he actually strikes more. But Dre Russ is not really a pinch hitter, he's really the first of a whole different breed entirely. And perhaps so is Narine and maybe even Willey as, semi-permanent pinch hitters. Which I know as a term doesn't really make as much sense. But both of these guys have been very successful. Even if Willey hasn't managed to do it at the IPL so far, and sometimes with Narine it doesn't look like he's successful because he gets out so quickly. But the proof is that they keep being sent up the order. The pinch hitters who fail don't get that many more chances. And these days in T20 cricket, that's most of them.